In this chapter, we're going to talk about one of the key findings from the Bayer Veterinary Care Usage Study, and that has to do with marketing your practice. This is the second in the solutions that we're talking about. Following this one, we'll talk about communicating the need for care, managing pricing, friending cats, and then making it convenient for clients to visit your practice. One section of the study was a driver analysis, and what that part of the study was trying to do was look at attributes of practices that were correlated with increased visits. And so one of the things that we found in the study was that marketing and advertising were one of the attributes that were most associated with increased visits. So in the practices that had been seeing increased visits over the last year or two, those were practices that engaged more heavily in marketing and advertising than other practices. And so one of the ways that we measured that was through a statement that said marketing and advertising are important tools to run a successful practice today. About a quarter of practices completely agreed with that. About half of practices somewhat agreed, and another 16% were neutral. But there was a chunk of practices who were not comfortable with marketing and advertising, and actually those practices who felt that advertising undermines my credibility as a veterinarian actually that attribute was associated with a decrease in visits. So it seems very clear that marketing and advertising are ever more important in attracting new clients and continuing to attract your current clients back to your practice. The active use of social media such as Facebook was also one of the attributes most associated with increased visits. And another kind of marketing activity, that of having referral arrangements with other pet service providers, practices who did not have those referral arrangements tended to be practices that had decreased visits over the last couple of years. So a clear correlation between the use of marketing and advertising with increases in visits, and the lack of marketing and advertising correlated with a decline in visits. Web-based communication has certainly gotten a lot of talk time lately everywhere, not just in veterinary medicine. What's very interesting, and this information does not come from the Bayer study, and instead it comes from the 2009 Nicholson-Kovac Veterinary and New Media Usage Study. And what this study shows us is that, again, we've been talking about disconnects. There's a big disconnect between veterinary medicine and the usage of web-based communication by dog and cat owners. Dog and cat owners are much more likely to use social media and to text than other consumers, but when we look at veterinary activity, we find that only 54% of small animal veterinarians use email with clients. About 3/4 of veterinarians are not at all or only slightly familiar with social media sites, and only 50% see social media as a marketing opportunity. So we're behind the curve on this one, most veterinary practices anyways. You're certainly seeing some individual practices that are engaging in social media activities more than they used to and more than their colleagues, but this is clearly something we're going to have to pay more attention to as we move forward. When you ask veterinarians about their attitude toward attracting new clients, and we use the statement, I am always trying new ways to attract clients, we had about 22% of practices who said, yes, I'm always trying to attract new clients. Another third of practices said somewhat agreed with that statement. So yeah, they're doing it, not quite as much as the first group, but still they're trying to attract new clients. About a quarter of practices were neutral about this. So maybe they're trying, maybe they're not. And then about 20% of practices just flat out said, no, this is not something that we're working on. The majority of practices either completely agree with this statement or somewhat agree with this statement. So the majority of practices feel that they are always trying new ways to attract clients, or at least that's what they say. But what's interesting is that when you actually look at the kinds of marketing activities that practices engage in, it doesn't bear out what they think they're doing isn't really what they appear to actually be doing. So if you look at the top marketing and advertising activities that practices engage in, 77% of practices have a website. Certainly that's a good thing. It is surprising a quarter of practices don't have a website. And of course, this survey didn't do anything to measure the quality of websites. And there are many, many bad websites out there. I've looked at websites where the only photo on the website is a stock photo of a veterinarian that actually has a practice 2,000 miles away from the practice whose website I was looking at, where there aren't pictures, there aren't graphics, it's hard to navigate, you can't find directions to the practice, you can't find a phone number. So it's not only important to have a website, but it has to be an attractive website and one that's easy for clients to navigate and get the information that they need. Practices are still heavily engaging in Yellow Pages advertising. About 74% of practices said yes, they do have Yellow Page ads. What we couldn't measure from this study is how extensive that Yellow Page advertising is. From my experience with practices, while I think most practices still have Yellow Pages, which is obviously was confirmed by this study, I think many practices have dramatically reduced the amount of money that they spend on Yellow Pages and the amount of space that they have. But still, these are the top two forms of advertising. Once we move past the top two items on this list, there's a pretty dramatic drop between the second most used item, most used marketing and advertising activity, and the third one. The third item was a free exam given to pets or to pet owners for pets adopted from a shelter. And that's almost a 30% drop or 30 percentage points difference between the second item on the list and the third on the list. There's about 5 or 6 items in kind of this middle category. So Facebook is used by 43% of practices, local advertising, clinic brochures, incentives to existing clients when they refer other clients. There's 5 or 6 of these activities that somewhere between a third and not quite a half of practices engage in. But there's a lot of practices who are not engaging in those kinds of things. And then when you look at other things like specials or discounts, welcome wagon, other social media, pet ID cards, pet owner seminars, a whole bunch of things, very few practices are engaging in those activities. What's important to me about this slide, there's a couple of key points here. Number one, we're primarily using clinic websites and Yellow Page advertising. I think clinic websites are important, but they need to be decent quality websites. I personally think that practices still need some kind of a listing in the Yellow Pages, but I don't think that that should be regarded as a primary form of successful marketing and advertising for a practice. It's clear that there are many other things that practices could be doing. You can look at this laundry list here and there would be others beyond it, but it's also clear that many practices are not engaging in a wide variety of marketing and advertising activities. And to assume that Yellow Pages and a website are going to do everything that's needed to be done to bring clients in is not a good assumption. Practices are going to have to engage in a wider variety of marketing and advertising activities. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how misinformed pet owners are about the need for veterinary care and what practices can do to reverse that.